So we are on to chapter 17, which is speciation and actually macroevolution, not microevolution. So you should all read chapter 17 in your textbook, and we're going to go over the key topics here. So we've been talking about microevolution, which is the small-scale evolution that happens within populations. So how do allele frequencies change from generation to generation, looking at one single population? Well, now we're going to switch into talking about macroevolution, which is actually history of like the evolution of all living things on Earth. So macroevolution involves speciation, which is the species of the splitting of one species into two or more. So this is a consequence of microevolution. So we get speciation from microevolution, from changing alleles, from founder effect, from bottleneck. That's how we get speciation. The grand scheme of all speciation is macroevolution. So the same kinds of things that are at play in microevolution, such as population size and genetic drift and mutation and migration, all of those things still come into play in macroevolution. We're just looking at them in a much larger scale and how precisely they change into a new species. So rather than looking at how one species changes over generations, we're looking at how the changes lead to new species. So your book defines it as macroevolution, so big, large picture evolution, is the result of the accumulation of microevolutionary changes that result in the formation of new species. And so your textbook asks, what is a species? And basically, you guys have the capability to recognize many different kinds of species. You know that humans are a different species than dogs. Dogs are a different species than cats. Cats are different than squirrels, which are different than dandelions, which are different than oak trees. You guys can see that very clearly. But some things that you can see might appear to look the same, but they're actually different species. So you can say very clearly that we are different than an oak tree, but what are the differences between different kinds of oak trees, and what makes one species of oak tree a species different from another species of oak tree? So that process of picking out different species is called classification, and we rely on a taxonomist to do this. So a taxonomist is a scientist that classifies organisms into groups, such as species. And so a taxonomist will make a hypothesis about different species, and then over time these will either be solidified or changed as new information comes into the picture. And so there's 4 different ways that biology kind of looks at how to identify a species. And these are called species concepts. And so it's a concept of what a species is. And there's 4 of them, like I said: morphological species concept, the evolutionary species concept, the phylogenetic species concept, and the biological species concept. And we're going to talk about all of these. So the first one is the morphological species concept, and this is the most basic one, which is identifying new species based on morphology. And this has been done from forever, but there was one scientist named Carolus Linnaeus who started this whole thing, started naming them. And Carolus Linnaeus was a scientist, and he came up with the system of binomial nomenclature, which means living things having 2 names. So it's your genus name and your species name. So we are Homo sapiens, our genus name is Homo, and our species name is Sapiens. And so that was defined by Carolus Linnaeus. And so he named tons and tons and tons of species when he was alive. And he named these species based on physical characteristics, which is morphology. Morphology means physical characteristics. And he looked at specific things called diagnostic traits, which he thought were distinctive of specific species. And so a lot of these species have been recognized for over 200 years since Carolus Linnaeus started doing this. There are definitely some disadvantages to the morphological species concept, being that morphology can be very misleading. So think of it this way: if you were going to group all things that had wings together, you would have birds, but you would also have bats, and you would also have insects and things like that. So you might think that just because birds and bats have wings, that they are closely related to each other, maybe even the same species. But in reality, we know that birds are birds and bats are mammals, and they are not closely related. So there are also these things called cryptic species, which are species that look almost identical but actually have traits that make them very different. So there's a figure in your textbook on page 308 that shows 3 different species of frogs that live throughout the United States, and they appear to be identical, but they actually have different behaviors that prevent them from being one species. They have different mating calls that distinguish them from species to species. So those are called cryptic species because they appear to be the same, but they're actually different. And the last one is that the fossil record doesn't account for anything other than bone structure. So it doesn't account for behaviors, it doesn't account for changes in soft tissues, so changes in muscles or anything like that. It only accounts for bones. So we can't make very many assumptions about species based on the fossil record if we're just looking at morphological species concept. The second species concept is the evolutionary species concept, and this was proposed to explain speciation in the fossil record. So this relies on morphology, but it also looks at evolutionary pathways. And so it says that small changes in the fossil record are just transition states. They're not new species. And so abrupt changes indicate new species. So this example is from page 310 in your textbook, and it's of the orca whale, the toothed whale. And your textbook says that the species depicted in this figure are part of the evolutionary history of the orca whale. These species can be recognized individually by the differences in diagnostic traits. So here this whale, or the ancestor of the whale, has limbs for walking. This one has limbs for swimming and walking. This one has ones that are very reduced and only used for swimming. And this one has no hind limbs. Still has the vestigial structures, but no hind limbs whatsoever. So they share an evolutionary pathway that's different from any other species. So that is one species right there. The fourth species concept is the phylogenetic species concept. And this defines species by an evolutionary family tree. And we call this family tree a phylogeny. And you guys should take a look and read the section on page 309, which is an evolution section. It's called The Anatomy of Speciation, and talks about phylogenetic trees. And you'll learn all about phylogenetic trees. And so these evolutionary trees, or phylogenies, are based on a common ancestor for 2 or more groups. So it's looking at how species are related to each other based on their common ancestors. And so by the phylogenetic species concept, a species is defined as the smallest set of interbreeding organisms that share a common ancestor. So the smallest group of living things that are capable of interbreeding that share a common ancestor. So birds and bats are not the same species because they do not share a recent common ancestor. And then we look at branches of the phylogenetic trees, and a branch that contains, or a group that contains all of the members of that branch is called monophyletic. Mono meaning one, and so just one route contains all descendants of a common ancestor. That is called monophyletic. And the good thing about the phylogenetic species concept is that it does not rely only on morphology to define a species. Rather, it actually looks at the DNA base sequences and things like that. Now, an example would be the giraffes that are shown in figure 17.3 on page 311 of your textbook. And it's shown how they appear to be very similar, except for their spots are a little different shaped. But when they actually looked at their DNA base sequences, they were able to see that there were 5 distinct groups, and they formed an evolutionary tree. And so they all share a common ancestor, but they're actually 5 different species. And lastly is the biological species concept. And this is the one you guys might be the most familiar with. And this relies on reproductive isolation rather than shared traits or ancestry. So rather than looking at similar tails, similar feathers, or their most recent common ancestor, we look at 2 groups of species and we say, 2 groups of living things, and we say, can they reproduce? Can they make offspring? And if they cannot, it's called reproductive isolation, which is defined as a lack of gene flow between groups. So basically, these 2 groups are not interbreeding and producing offspring. So this is the cause of physiological, behavioral, or genetic processes that inhibit interbreeding. And so the biological species concept is really useful in theory, but not applicable to all groups. For example, in real life, you might think that two groups of frogs are reproductively isolated for whatever reason, but they may never live near each other to interbreed in real life. And doesn't apply to things such as asexually producing organisms like bacteria. We can't define by the biological species concept, and we also can't apply it to the fossil record because we didn't know if they could interbreed or not. So let's talk about some reproductive isolating mechanisms. So now we know that the biological species concept means, can they produce fertile offspring, yes or no? And if not, what's stopping it? And so that would be a reproductive isolating mechanism. And they block successful reproduction from occurring. So to be clear, it's possible that reproduction is happening, that these two living things are reproducing and making offspring, but their offspring cannot successfully reproduce. They would be sterile or infertile. And so these reproductive isolating mechanisms can occur before or after fertilization. Fertilization meaning when the egg and the sperm join to form a zygote. So a zygote is the earliest stages of life. So if something happens before fertilization to prevent it from happening, we call that a prezygotic mechanism. Something that stops a zygote from forming. And if it happens after fertilization, after we've made a zygote, we call it a postzygotic mechanism because we've already formed the zygote. And so the prezygotic mechanisms prevent reproductive attempts or make it unlikely that fertilization will be successful if mating is attempted. So basically anything to prevent the sperm and the egg from forming a zygote. And the sperm and the egg forming a zygote is called hybridization. Hybridization is the mating between two species, and prezygotic mechanisms make it unlikely to happen. So hybridization would be two different species of birds coming together to form a third, to form a new kind. So here's species 1 of this bird, here's species 2. If they were successfully reproducing together, they would form a hybrid. So there's 5 different kinds of prezygotic mechanisms. The first is habitat isolation, which is fairly straightforward. If these two living things don't ever cross paths, they don't live in the same geographic area, they don't live in the same layer of the canopy of the rainforest. If they're not going to cross paths, they're never going to reproduce. Sperm and egg are never going to meet. They're never going to have a zygote. Temporal isolation. If these groups of living things reproduce at different times of the year, they're never going to have their sperm and their egg meet. For example, here's a figure of when different frogs reproduce that all live in the same area, but they all reproduce at different times. So the green frog is sexually active in the beginning of June, whereas the wood frog is sexually active right in the middle of April or at the beginning of April. So even if they could reproduce, it would never happen at the same time. So their sperm and their egg are not going to meet. Behavioral isolation comes into play when two different groups of living things require a specific mating call, mating behavior, but for whatever reason, they're incompatible. So figure 17.6 on page 312 of your textbook shows the blue-footed booby. They cannot reproduce because they have different mating dances than other groups. Mechanical isolation is when physically two living things, their genitals do not match together, so they cannot get the sperm and the egg to meet together. Gamete isolation is when, for whatever reason, the sperm and the egg meet, but they are not compatible. This could be different numbers of chromosomes, it could be problems with chemicals, but the sperm and the egg actually meet each other, but they are not capable of reproducing. And then postzygotic mechanisms happen after the zygote has formed, so the sperm and the egg have met and formed a zygote. And they prevent successful reproduction of the offspring. So this could be hybrid inviability, meaning that the offspring, the hybrid that we just made, this bird right here that we just made, either it's unhealthy, so it dies early, it never gets to reproductive age, etc., or it's very healthy, it lives for a very long time, but it is incapable of reproducing. An example of this is when a horse and a donkey mate together, they make a mule. A mule is very healthy, can live for a very long time, but is entirely incapable of reproducing, so it is infertile. And that is an example of hybrid infertility. So take a look at this. It will explain the prezygotic and the postzygotic.